All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Like I said, I'm Jon Knepp. I'm the director at Thompson Free Library. And today I'm going to be talking about the history of the Thompson Free Library, focusing mostly on the lead up to the founding of the library, the founding of it, and then a little bit after that. So before we get started, I have a few things. First off, I'm from away. I'm not from town. I'm going to mispronounce someone's name at some point, so I'm just going to apologize ahead of time. I'm going to screw up at least 2 or 3 facts. I've run a lot of stuff by Carlson and Phyllis, so hopefully I'll be able to get through it without screwing up too much. So most of this presentation is based off of Lou Stevens' research. He has the 100-year history of the library. He has a few other books about the town. The library's Piscataquis Observer Archive, which the Historical Society has helped us with, and is a really great resource, and also the county's deed collection. So I spent a lot of Tuesday researching deeds. We'll get into that later because it's kind of messy when it comes to the library and the land that the library sits on. So I first started working with newspapers back in 2007, which is a while ago at this point. I was still in college and I was working on the Pennsylvania Historic Newspaper Project, which was a project with the National Endowment for the Humanities that was trying to preserve as many historic newspapers as they could. We were trying to find physical copies of newspapers and preserve them, get them microfilmed, get them digitized, and get them in secure storage. And so I worked with a lot of really fascinating newspapers. And they're a great source. They're a really neat window into everyday life in the past. If you want to know who's fighting with who, who's visiting who, who's just in town that day, it's in these old newspapers. But it's also really fascinating as a primary source because you kind of get into the head of the person who writes the newspaper. And in this case, it's Liston Evans. But this is from a paper that I worked in college called the Huntington Journal. But the actual name of it was the Anti-Masonic Democratic Whig Huntington Journal, because they also got very, very political. And as you'll see here, right under the masthead, it has about the county convention. So that's first news of the day, is just county convention. And up here we have Whig organization, and it's pleading with the Whigs to vote with the Democrats that year. This was in 1845. And then down here it has the road to ruin. There's a lot of stories like this in the old newspapers that I love. And this one particularly is about gambling and how if you start gambling, your life is going to hell in a handbasket. I mean, you're going to be destitute, your family will leave you, you'll have no money left. And it's just really fascinating because these 100% are just the thoughts of the editor of the day. And so depending on who ran the newspaper in the town, it's always a really interesting insight. So in doing this research, you learn a lot about Liston Evans because if it's in his paper, it's something he agrees with. And so this is our Thompson Free Library Community History Archive. This is my one plug. We do have all of the observers. We have all of the FA yearbooks from 1940 to 2021. We also have the Piscataquis Farmer, the Piscataquis Herald, and the Democratic Republican, which were some newspapers that preceded the Observer. All digitized, all online on our website. And if you want help getting to that, you can reach out. So we're going to start this story with a little bit about Liston Evans. So he originally was a pharmacist, and then he bought the Observer in 1888 and owned it from 1949. His son Ora owned it for another 20 years. And previous to those two owning the paper, George and Samuel Eads, there you go. Okay, I screwed up one name. Owned it for 50 years preceding that. Liston Evans also moved it to the Flatiron Building. So you see that for about 130 years, these two families owned the newspapers in town. And when you think about it, the newspaper is really the only local media people are consuming at that time. So for 130 years, it was kind of in control of these two families. For better or worse, and I'm going to say for better with Liston Evans here. Not all newspaper editors you can say that about, but Liston was a pretty good guy. He was on the board of the first telephone company and the first electric power company, the railroad, and he used his editorial to call for things that he wanted to see. So this is just a short list of the things that I ran into in my research. He really wanted businesses to work together. He wanted a chamber of commerce way before there was a chamber of commerce. He loved Memorial Day. A lot of the people we're going to talk about today were veterans of the Civil War. They really wanted to celebrate Memorial Day. He really wanted concrete, not plank sidewalks. And this here is an editorial that he wrote about how on a rainy day, Summer Street is muddy and unfit for travel. And if they don't make it concrete, they should at least put some gravel. And then he says about Union Square that they dug up Union Square and carted in rocks, and it's a lot better now. So you see that he's really pushing for things that he wants to see in the town through his newspaper. And his son Ora did a little bit of that. Newspapers kind of changed and evolved after the turn of the century, and it was less polemic, but still there was some of that. And his son was a member of the Thompson Free Library Association, where he was the treasurer, he was the trustee, and he was president of the association at different times. And my clicker didn't work. There we go. So one of the things, luckily for us and for the town, that Liston Evans really wanted was a library. There were a few attempts at libraries in town before the Thompson Free Library. Here we have on the left Thompson and Kittredge, one of those names is going to come up later, actually had a library in his store at the Mayo block in town. And he charged 5 cents a week or $2 a year to join. He had late fees on his books, but it wasn't a free library. In 1896, Liston Evans, again using the paper as a way to voice the things he wanted to see in town, said that there has been a feeling that our village is large enough to support a public library. And he goes on and says, some ladies are making a move towards the organization, and that everyone is going to meet at the Blevin House to discuss instituting a public library. There aren't any records that I've seen of who was at that meeting, what was discussed at the meeting, anything like that. But not too long after that, first we're going to talk about the Mayo block a little bit, because this is interesting to me as well. If you don't know where the Mayo block is, it's now True Value, just downtown here. And before the fire in 1895, which this is a picture from the Observer of the fire, it had a much different roof, and it had a third floor that was, the whole thing was full of businesses. The first 3 floors were businesses. So in that same block, Dr. Thompson, who founded the library, had a medical office, a store, and a soda counter in that store. Charles Kimball, who we'll talk about a little bit later as well, was also in the Mayo block. Liston Evans Pharmacy, before he bought the Observer, was in the Mayo block as well. And then after he bought the Observer, he moved the Observer to the Mayo block. And upstairs in the top floor of this was the GAR meeting hall, which a lot of these people were discussing were members of the GAR, being Civil War veterans and proud veterans. And they stored all of their uniforms and rifles and materials on the 3rd floor, which was destroyed in the fire. So this is a case with all 3 of these individuals being in the same building with the Observer. There was a lot of cross-pollination of ideas going on, and there's no direct evidence for this, but we do know from Lou Stevens, he likes to elaborate on things. I don't know if it's 100% true, but he does say that Liston Evans heard that the Observer was for sale because he worked in the same building, and so he went and put an offer in on it before a Democrat bought it. And then they would take over the paper and turn it into a Democratic paper. So I thought that was pretty funny. So there's a lot of these things going on where you can tell that these people are talking in the background to each other, and then it makes it in the paper after they've discussed it with what they want to do. So after the meeting, this is about a year after the meeting that was held at the Blevin House, Liston Evans, he likes to put kind of gossip, it's kind of news, but it's also, this is what's happening in town. He says, a very agreeable piece of news was circulated, and he says that Dr. E.A. Thompson has offered to donate a library to the town, but he just wants to get it in the paper. He says next week we may be able to give a more extended notice of the matter. So this is just an announcement that a library is going to happen. So the next week in the paper, he has a quote, he has a whole article, but the quote from Dr. Thompson is pretty fascinating, because he says, I submit the following proposition to my fellow townsmen and the taxpayers of the town for their action. He says, I will erect a building to be used as a library, the town will furnish the lot, and then he says, that I will give $400 a year while I'm alive and then $10,000 after I die towards the funding of that library. That doesn't seem like a lot of money these days, but if you look up what $10,000 in 1897 is worth now, that's a pretty big investment in the town. Okay, so after Dr. Thompson makes his big announcement, library plans start solidifying a little bit. We're going to get back into that theme of the same 3 or 4 people in the town are really pushing for a library, and because of who they are in the town, they're making it happen. So this is the Dover Town meeting in 1897, which Dr. Thompson is the moderator of the town meeting, and he's also the person proposing a library. So there's a pretty good chance that it's going to happen because he's moderating the meeting. So he says, the proposition made by Dr. Thompson relative to a free library was then acted upon. Colonel Peaks explained it, and there was one dissenting vote heard. And Lou Stevens tears into this guy in his book. I don't know if you've all read the book or not, but in the book he says, I wonder if that miserable individual ever graced the doors of the library and what he thought about his dissenting vote. Lou's really, I really like his phrasing of things. He really speculates on what happened. Immediately after that, the next day, Dr. Thompson and Wainwright Cushing head to Washington for President McKinley's inauguration. So he had a busy week. He was very involved politically. I really like this woodcut over here as well. This is from March 11th of 1897. And this is a woodcut of the proposed library. And it's pretty accurate, even though it's a pretty preliminary model. I'm really fascinated by how Evans got, some of these woodcuts are amazing. Like the one from the fire was less than a week after the fire happened, but it's very elaborate. He must have had an illustrator on staff. So I'm very, like I said, I get really into newspapers sometimes. So this is a drawing of the library before the town meeting. He says, next Monday, the voters of the town will be called upon to take action at Thompson's proposition, which has already been published. We have no doubt of the result of this action, for propositions are too rare to be turned down. So again, this is Liston Evans kind of grandstanding and really pushing for things he wants to see in town, which, again, for all of our benefit, luckily he has some good intentions, because with some of this power, you could really push some really crazy things for a town. So we're really fortunate that these 3 or 4 people in the town were the ones that seem to be making things happen.
How many square feet is that section?
That's a good question. I don't know offhand.
It doesn't look that big, but it must be a couple thousand.
So, Dr. Elbridge Augustus Thompson, which is a mouthful if you've never seen his full name. They don't make first and middle names like that anymore, really. He was born in Sangerville on January 4th, 1828. He attended Foxcroft Academy. His family still lived in Sangerville while he attended FA. They did eventually move to Dover, and after he graduated, he attended Bowdoin College for 2 years until he graduated. And then he went to Castleton, Vermont Medical School from 1850 to 1852. So in 4 years, he went to college and went to medical school. This is a picture of the Castleton Medical School. It's one of the oldest medical schools in the country. It's no longer its own medical school. It's part of Castleton University, but it's a very nice Vermont town. Very cute little one-room schoolhouse medical school. He moved back to the area, to Charleston, and was a doctor in Charleston, and married Marion Foss of Charleston in 1854. And he was a widower the following year. She died in 1855. This is her gravestone, which Phyllis helped me find through Find a Grave. And not really that much is known about her. We know that she died and she was 20 years and 9 months old. Lou Stevens, again, speculated that she died in childbirth. I couldn't find, there weren't any death records going back that far that the state had. Penobscot County didn't have them as well. I called the Charleston town office. They said they didn't have them, so I guess they're just lost. Lou Stevens, like I said, speculated that she died in childbirth, but there's no way really to know that. I kind of thought that the 20 years and 9 months might add some credibility to that, because why would you say 9 months if it wasn't?
Where's the stone at?
It's in Charleston. I don't know the exact graveyard.
They might have it in the church there or something.
Yeah, they could have something in the church there. So she died in 1855, and in 1858 he remarried Lucia Eddy of Corinth, and they were married until her death in 1897. And they never had any kids. Lou Stevens again says that what a shame that we don't have more Thompsons around, but maybe if we had more Thompsons, we might not have the library. So I really like when he elaborates in the book. It really goes well. So this is a portrait of Dr. Thompson that's hanging in the library, and this is Mary Greeley, who painted the portrait. Dr. Thompson was in the Civil War. He was a Union surgeon from May 10th, 1862 to December of 1864. He was with the 12th Regiment of the Maine Volunteers. He was claimed to never have missed a day of work, which is pretty impressive because Army surgeons were seeing dealing with some of the worst conditions, injuries, disease was rampant in some of those battles. And with his position in the Army, he would have been right behind the front lines helping to assist recently wounded soldiers not in a field hospital. This is a picture of him during the Civil War, actually, which was pretty interesting to find on the Maine Memory Net, which is hosted by the state. And this is actually a field hospital of the 12th Maine. Pretty hard to tell if Dr. Thompson's in the picture, but this would have been similar conditions to what he would have seen during the war. And he was all along the Mississippi from New Orleans to Vicksburg, Tennessee, and later when the Mississippi was secured, the 12th Maine was moved to the Shenandoah Valley until the end of the war. So these are some of the major battles he was in. I found this pretty interesting. He was at Passemenchaugh, Louisiana in 1862. They captured some artillery and a strategic bridge near New Orleans during the New Orleans campaign. He was in Irish Bend in Louisiana. This was the first expedition into western Louisiana, kind of away from the Mississippi River a little bit. It opened that area to Union expansion. He was in Port Hudson, where they captured the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi. And this was supposedly a pretty violent siege battle that lasted, you can see, for a couple of weeks. Donaldsonville, Louisiana, they drove rebels from the area to help further open up the Mississippi, and this was really one of the last battles for control of the Mississippi. The Union had already claimed it, but the Confederates were having a counterattack to try to retake it. After that, the 12th Maine was moved to Winchester, Virginia. It was one of the largest and costliest fights of the Shenandoah Valley and the beginning of the end of the South's resistance. Shenandoah Valley had a lot of soldiers coming in, a lot of supplies, so control of the valley was very important once the war moved back down south from the Gettysburg campaign. And in Cedar Creek, Virginia, in October 19th, this was the last Confederate offensive in the valley and helped to ensure Lincoln's re-election. A lot of people don't know how close the 1864 election could have been. Lincoln was basically running to continue the war, and there was an opposing party that wanted to just sue for peace and end the war with the South, basically where it was. And it was, if you look at the newspapers of the time, it's surprisingly a close-looking political fight until Cedar Creek, where the Confederates were kicked out of the valley. There were some other big victories in some of the western campaigns, and the war really started to turn around to the point where Lincoln's victory was assured. And this is a picture, this isn't of the 12th Maine, but these are some bears that different regiments had mascots. They would have a dog, they would have a goat, they would have sheep. The 12th Maine had bears that they found in Louisiana, and they marched them around to each battle, and at one point they were marching in the ranks. And even when they went to the Shenandoah Valley, they went with the bears, and the bears would just march with the drummers. And apparently, I found that pretty interesting when I was researching the 12th Maine. So once he returned to civilian life, he originally moved back to Bangor, and he helped with one of the army offices there. But then in January 12th, 1865, this is another announcement from the Observer, just saying that Dr. Thompson is moving back to Dover and announcing that he intends to open a practice. There were a lot of personal accounts of Dr. Thompson as a doctor, and one of these is from Judge Calvin Brown, who said, when Dr. Thompson's bill was presented, I noticed that he had charged just one half of what other physicians charge when traveling the same distance, and sometimes he charged nothing. This is pretty typical of country doctors at the time, but they said that Dr. Thompson was especially fair. So he was voted to the state legislature. He was a 3-time delegate to the Republican National Committee. He was Surgeon General to Governor Parham in 1874, and he was honorary colonel because of that appointment as a Surgeon General, though he refused to call himself a colonel, which I think I would have taken advantage of that if I was an honorary colonel, but he didn't go the Colonel Sanders route with that. He was an FA trustee for 41 years, and he moderated the town meetings for over 25 years. And there were many more things that he did around town. He was on the school committee, he was in the Masons, the GAR, he was a railroad trustee, banks. He set up the town water district, amongst others. And these are just some of the things that I found. Phyllis found a lot of them too, of Dr. Thompson. Some of these were already seen, just ads for his store. He sold drugs, dye stuff, stationery, cigars, tobacco. Here it advertises his soda fountain, which was a new thing at the turn of the century, and people apparently loved it. This is some of his paperwork for the GAR, which I said he was a pretty big part of. Here's another ad for his store. He also, Carlson got me this picture of Dr. Thompson. He had one of the first automobiles in town, but he was scared to death of driving it after the chain broke and it began to go backwards downhill and alarmed him. And it rather diminished his interest in motoring is what the caption says. So, and this is another thing that we had at the library, his GAR memorial or ceremonial sword hanging up by his picture and the picture of his wife. This is a slide from, I believe, the 80s. It disappeared sometime in the 90s. We don't know if somebody threw it out the window and then went and collected it, or if they went out the front door. But if anyone sees this sword, it has a pretty distinctive, it's like a Roman or a Greek helmet on the hilt.
It's a classic army sword.
Yeah.
I don't want to like it. You
Oh.
Funny how the guy that lives right behind the library.
Yeah, right. I
I'll
knew
be
it.
back there tomorrow.
Okay, all right. We won't ask any questions if it just shows up. So this is Lucia Eddy Thompson, his wife. This is like I said, these portraits were painted at about the same time. And the story is that when her portrait was painted, Dr. Thompson said that his wife looked too dour and he asked for her to be repainted. And so this is the touch-up where she looks less dour, but she still looks a little, she maybe should have tried again. She still looks a little stern. Some interesting things I found out about her. Her great-great-grandfather was Jonathan Eddy, who he tried to bring the Revolutionary War to Nova Scotia. So he's originally from Massachusetts. He had moved to Nova Scotia, and when the Revolution broke out in the colonies, he tried to take a fort in Nova Scotia and, bring Nova Scotia into the fold. He lost, and so he ran away to Maine, where he moved to Machias, and he helped to defend Machias from the British invasion during the Revolutionary War. As a result of that, he was granted the land that became Eddington, which was named after him. So her family has Eddington named after them. She married E.A. Thompson in May of 1858, and she was described as naturally retiring, modest, living in and for her home, and endeared herself to everyone that knew her. There's not too much else about her in the record, but this was an interesting part of the research that I did because the deeds and the land for the library was a little bit messy. I talked to Jefferson today after I made these slides. This house was not the house that was moved from where the library is. It's the house beside Jefferson's house. So this slide is incorrect, but we will talk about Jefferson's house later.
It might have been moved, but I know that the house next to me was moved quite a distance
Yeah.
over to the river.
Which,
I don't know about this one. The left portion is from the Civil War era, the 1864 era.
When I was doing this research, I found that moving houses was a lot more common back then than I ever thought it would be. It seems like a big undertaking, or we would do it today, but apparently it was very common at this time that they would just move a house. There were several houses moved off of the library property to other places, not torn down. So this is from the town report. When the land for the library was bought, you'll see that some of the money went to J.B. Peaks, some of it went to E.A. Thompson, and some of it went to Amanda Palmer. And this actually is the deed that Dr. Thompson signed, this middle portion, whenever he bought the land for the library. And how did he get that land? That's where it gets a little bit messy. So Dr. Thompson purchased the land that the library sits on mostly from his sister Amanda Palmer and his brother-in-law. So this is Amanda's deceased husband's brother, who each owned shares in the land. And it was originally owned by Amanda's husband Caleb, but when he died, it was split up amongst his wife and his brother. And before that, that whole area was part of the Favor homestead. So this is one of the deeds that I found where Ira Palmer, who was Caleb Palmer's brother, is giving his half of the land to E.A. Palmer in order to build the library. And it continues to get interesting. So this is the Palmer lot, which was west of the library. The sale of it was finally finalized to the town in 1906. This is from the 1906 town report, asking to accept conveyance of that property. But before that, it had been owned kind of sort of loosely by the trustees of the library from Amanda Palmer, who set it aside as the Caleb Orrin Palmer Library Reservation. It was only to be used as per her deed when she deeded it to the association, to be used for the beautification of the town and the library, not to have a permanent structure built on it. And that even, it seems like at some point looking at the deed, she lived maybe where the police station is now or beside that, because there's stipulations in the deed that if she didn't like something in this lot, she could have it taken out. So she still sort of controlled it up until 1906. Yeah, Jane.
It was my understanding from the select board that nothing is to be built on that segment of, we were talking, expansion of this, and it's like, nope.
It does make weird stipulations, but a lot of it is set up for Amanda so that if she didn't like a shrub, she could say, take out that shrub, or it's really weird, but it does say no permanent buildings. The wording is very interesting. And a lot of the things going along with the library are these kind of agreements that seem to have made sense 125 years ago, but today really make you scratch your head sometimes. But it's worked out because nothing is built there. It's a beautiful lot, and now we have this tree with the bells here, which is very beautiful, and it's just a nice space for the community. There's not as many green spaces in town, so it's a good thing that this was set aside. This is not as happy and rosy. This is Caleb Palmer. I was trying to find out why all of this happened, and what happened was Caleb Palmer died September 6th of 1894. His house was where you saw the Palmer lot here. It was closer to the road, and back about where the parking lot is for the police station, he had a stable. The stable caught on fire, and Caleb had some really prized horses that were racing horses and show horses, and so he rushed into the stable to try to save them and passed out and burned to death in the stable. The stable was lost, but the house was saved. And here is a write-up of the fire from that night. It happened at 10:30 in the evening, so it was in the middle of the night. And it mentions a W.E. Stearns who tried to run into the stable to save Caleb, as he had been on the Boston Fire Department previous to moving to Dover. And he said that Caleb was already dead when he got in, when he looked in the stable, and it was too hot, so he had to leave. And there was a milk cow and a hog that were lost in addition to these horses. So it was a very big fire. It was in the middle of town. Everyone saw it. And here's actually his death certificate from the county, which says, burned to death in stables, which is a very grim way to go. In the same page, there's this story, which I found very bizarre. It just is called The Spook. And it says, for nearly 2 weeks, there has been considerable excitement of, basically there's a ghost that's over in the cove, and then they've seen it in different parts of town. And it says, some say it's a woman, others that it's a man arrayed in loose flowing garments of white, with frightful looking eyes peering about. But you have to remember that Evans is friends with all these people, so he's friends with Caleb Palmer. So this last paragraph is really his trying to squash these rumors that there's like a ghost of Caleb Palmer haunting the town, because he says that this erect and moving being is one of flesh and blood. There can be no denial, and the time has come when the community should be rid of its annoyance. If it's an insane person, they should deal with it. If it's a tramp, which he always is railing against tramps in the paper, he said, then the vagrant law should be promptly put into requisition. The spook theory is too absurd to be entertained for a moment. So this, again, you see Evans putting his opinions of things. Not that I'm saying that there was a ghost in town, but he's really trying to, get rid of these rumors that are going around. So I just found that fascinating, that there's this big fire and a death, and then there's the ghost going around town at the same time. It really
down over near the pavilion.
Yeah. I think it's just you.
Yeah, it's not here.
Okay, this is another really confusing part. This is the Favor House, which was a tavern in town. Does anyone know, was it on the west side or the east side of the library, the Favor House?
The west side.
The west side. Does anyone think it's on the east side? Has anyone heard that it's on the east side? Okay, this is where it gets confusing. The answer is yes. So, on the west side over here, we have the Favor House Tavern, which was torn down in 1895. So Caleb Palmer lived in the Favor House Tavern. His funeral was in the house, because I had heard that it had burned down as well. But if his funeral was in the house, it couldn't have burned down. But Amanda tore it down in 1895. So the following year, she had this building torn down. And if you look at the deed of the library, it says that it's bounded on the east by the land of E.S. Favor, and on the right by the old yellow tavern stand, so-called. So on the west, the west is talking about the tavern that was there. But then you see that the east side is owned by E.S. Favor. So this is, on the east side, Eugene Favor sells to Charles Kimball, who we talked about later, also had a business in the Mayo block. All of the land on the east side, which did have a house on it. So it was owned by Favor and it had a house. And so there's been some confusion for years about which side the Favor house was on. And honestly, you're correct either way, but the tavern was on the west side, but there was a Favor house on the east side. And then you'll see here that Charles Kimball then sold it to basically the trustees of the library is who he sold that land to. It's really funny because these guys are all wheeler dealers in real estate as well. So you see that Favor sold the land for $1 to Charles Kimball, and then Charles Kimball sold it for $3,000 to the Library Association. But then there was also a mortgage on this land that Favor had that Frank Guernsey owned, which Kimball bought. So it was almost like he was behind on the mortgage and Kimball bought it and then he sold it for $3,000. So it's really just real estate wheeling and dealing at this time. So here is the Favor House Tavern. It was owned by Dr. Thompson's brother, E.G. Thompson, actually, who moved to Massachusetts, I believe before the war. But many years before Caleb and Amanda Palmer owned it, E.G. Thompson owned it. And like I said, it was torn down in 1895 and was to the west. Here is the Favor House, and I believe here's some other houses. Here's a bell that we have at the library, which dates from the 1830s, that was used at the Favor House to call people in for supper and lunch and things like that. So it's a pretty cool artifact to have of what used to be on the library grounds. But then the Favor House comes back, and I love this because this is from the 1921 town report, and it says use made of the Favor House, which had disappeared, or you thought it had disappeared. But the library apparently was storing things at something called the Favor House at that point. So there's still something called the Favor House, whether it's owned by one of the Favors or they opened up another business with the same name, I don't know. But it's like the Favor House just won't die. It's on the west side, it's on the east side, it's somewhere else here. But this is the Favor property, I'm gonna call it, or the Favor lot on the east side of the library. And again, it is just a green space now. We have a picnic table. People use it for different things.
Isn't that where see that house straight back as a cake?
That one right there.
That's the one that was moved.
Yep. So that house was moved from where the library is, not Jefferson's house. But Jefferson's house, your house is coming back into the picture soon. All right, so here we go. So this is Jefferson's house, was owned by Frank Guernsey, who was a state representative and later a U.S. representative. So Lou Stevens reports that at the 1920 Dover town meeting, Frank Guernsey announced that he knows 12 people who have secured this land on the east side of the library for future library use. And like I said, they purchased it for $3,000. Kimball made a little bit of money on the deal. So the town buys it for $100 from them. So they're really losing out. Frank Guernsey, interestingly enough, who comes to the town and says he has this idea, he was the justice of the peace, and he signed all the paperwork for all of these deeds and all of these real estate transactions. And Lou Stevens says that he did it so that he would have a better view of Main Street, so no one would build on it. So if you look, this is the house. Jefferson's house is actually blocked by the pavilion now, but with this clear, Frank Guernsey had a pretty clear view of the street, which is what he wanted all along. So he's wheeling and dealing, have his friends buy property from people to give to the library just so no one builds on it. And then he's making money and Charles Kimball's making money on it. It's very, these five guys kind of run the town. All right, so we're getting into the construction of the library. Here's a little bit about, from the Observer about Dr. Thompson giving the deed to the association. So Isaac Lunt of Bangor did the brick and stonework at the library. He did much of the stonework at UMaine, so if you see any brick or stone buildings at UMaine, he did a lot of that same work. Amongst other things, he did a lot of the Brewer and Bangor sewer system. So here's he did a toll bridge, he had a railroad bridge, he grew a really interesting flower the one year. Greta Schrader, who is the previous director, works at the Bangor Library now and helped me find things about Isaac Lunt that they have from their files. He also was in this play called The Turn of the Tide, so he's also an actor. And he was sued by one of his workers who said that he was sent into a trench all day that he knew was unsafe. The worker got hurt and he forced him back into the trench. And just because he helped build the Bangor and Brewer sewer system, I put the Pennywise the Clown with the balloon coming out of the sewers. So he inspired Stephen King just a little bit, maybe. So the construction continues. The carpenter work in 1898, April 28th, is just wrapping up. And at the same time, we have Miss Mary Averill is addressing the study of literature at the Free Baptist Chapel. It's really impressive to me that Dover's even a smaller town at this point because the same 6 people keep popping up throughout this story. And she'll come in a little bit later. And this is a list of some of the books that the library wanted before the dedication happened. So they wanted a Bible dictionary, a Bible, biographical dictionary, Walter Scott's novels, so on and so on. And finally, on September 1st, 1898, there's an announcement in the Observer that the library dedication will happen on the 9th. And then on September 10th, the library will be open for the circulation of books. And this is a picture from the dedication on September 9th, 1898. The dedication itself happened at Central Hall, but afterwards the library was open for tours. So these people are going in the original front doors, and they had displays inside, and it was all open and available to see. So just to show you how much Liston Evans loved the library, in case you didn't already know, the front page of the Observer after the dedication takes up 2/3 of the front page is all about the dedication. There's a picture of Dr. Thompson. This same woodcut is in there. And Dr. Thompson makes a speech, which I'm not going to read the entire speech, but he says, "This is one of the most pleasant acts of my life to transfer to you the building that I have erected for a free library for the town of Dover." And he says, "I have completed this building. I transfer to you this property and place it in the hands of the men you have elected as your representatives. My only wish is that you may be as gratifying to you to receive it as it is pleasant for me to transfer it." And then he says, I have but one favor to ask of you in the management, and that is that you may see your way clear to admit the privileges of the library, residents of our sister town of Foxcroft. Also during this program, I found another few things that I found interesting. So Mr. Tilden, whose first name is not listed in this, he goes on to talk about George Peabody, who built the Peabody Library in Baltimore and gave away over $8 million during his life, which was a lot back then. And he says that George Peabody gave away $8 million throughout his life, but per capita, that is 1/50th as large as what Dr. Thompson gave, because it's a smaller town. I just found it very funny that he's comparing Dr. Thompson's gift to this guy who gave $8 million, but saying it's such a small town that, you know, that's not that much money comparatively. And then he says, the library we value for school children, and saying they appreciate gifts more than older people, and that when we benefit our schools, we are benefiting generations to come, for mental improvement always leads to general improvement. And after the meeting, there were 3 cheers for Dr. Thompson, and Miss C.B. Emerson was the librarian and gave tours of the building. And it's a beautiful structure, handsomely and substantially finished, and conveniently arranged. And this is a poem that was read at the dedication called The Thompson Free Library. Again, I'm not going to read this entire poem. Tom read the entire poem at our pavilion dedication and did a great job, but I'm not Tom. And we don't have all day. So it's a really beautiful poem. Look it up. We have a copy of it in the library if you'd like to see it. And it was by Anna Boynton Averill, who was actually one of Maine's best loved and well-known poets at the time. So Whittier, Burroughs, Longfellow had collections of poetry and featured her poetry amongst their own and that of Emerson, Lowell, and others. One of her most famous poems is called Birch Stream. She often focused on nature. Dover-Foxcroft's most famous poet, except for Tom Lyford. And Edwin R. Champlin, in his Poets of Maine, said, "The most notable lyrically of all the singers of Maine living at that time, there were others equally poetical, but not one so purely and felicitously lyrical." That's a very poet word to put in a quotation. So she was very well known at the time, and she was from Dover. And there's a picture of her right there. There were some rules when the library opened. There weren't that many, but I found some of these interesting, mostly because it keeps talking about all persons of proper behavior are able to use the library. There was a fine of 2 cents a day if you were late, which was about 75 cents now. So it was pretty strict. But I guess you can only split a penny so many ways, so it would be either like 40 cents or 75 cents. Satisfactory references or a deposit may be asked of any person at any time at the discretion of the librarian. So if they didn't like the look of you, they could ask for references or a deposit. No one is allowed to enter the stacks or take any book from its place. And all books shall be returned to the library on the call of the librarian or the executive committee. So Nancy could have recalled books for all those years from people if she really wanted to. Okay, so this is another interesting story because the library is situated in Dover. Foxcroft isn't a completely separate town. Dr. Thompson really wanted Foxcroft residents to use the library as well. So Foxcroft voters voted to give $250 towards the library so that their residents could use the library. And then here's Liston Evans again pontificating, and he says, "The matter is now fixed as Dr. Thompson wanted it, just as every citizen of Dover wanted it, except that one guy, and just as the majority of people of Foxcroft wanted it. Those in Foxcroft who opposed the appropriation to the library of $250 on the grounds it could not be afforded may be sure the money is being well invested." So, here is from the 1904 Dover Town Meeting. So this was finalized in 1899, but even in 1904, every year at the town meeting, Dover would vote to see if Foxcroft could use the library that year, and also how much they had to pay. So it was kind of set, but it still had to go to the town meeting every single year. So this was great. This happened in the middle of March. They said people from Foxcroft can use the library. There was just one problem, in that it was completely illegal under the state constitution for Foxcroft residents to pay to use the Dover Library. Luckily, Frank Guernsey, who lives in Jefferson's house, which is apparently the house where you try to meddle with things going on at the library, like Jefferson does, he comes to the rescue, and this is really quick moving for a state legislature. In less than 2 weeks, he changes the constitution of the state to allow for, specifically for Foxcroft residents to use the library. So that's less than 2 weeks he's changed the state. I don't even know how he managed that. But as of April 1st, 1899, Foxcroft residents could use the library. And Frank Guernsey was a member of the Thompson Free Library Association. He was a state rep, later a US rep, and he even named his son Thompson Guernsey, which, again, you see how much these people like really worked together and really admired each other, it seems like. So this is Annie Emerson. She lived from 1857 to 1938, and she was the librarian from 1898 to 1907. And she, this is her obituary here on the left. She was married to Charles Emerson, who was a member of one of the military bands in town for over 50 years. So he was well known in town. She had been a school teacher before she was married. She was a telegraph operator, and she had done some other things around town. The first year the library was open, she made a whopping $58 that year, which is the equivalent of $4,500 a year now, which shows you how much inflation has happened. But that's still not all that great. And we're going to go through some town reports to show you kind of how that morphed over the years. So this is a 1901 town report, and in this year, the librarian's salary has tripled. It is $150 now, which is big, big money. They've also hired an assistant librarian at $25 a year, and there's a janitor for $35 a year, so she doesn't even have to clean up at the library. So she's really moving up in the world in 1901. 1902, though, something happened at the town meeting. She has a pay cut of $25 a year, and now the assistant librarian might be the janitor as well. So the assistant librarian has to clean up. And I found this interesting, that in 1902, the population was around 1,900 people. There were 1,500 library cards issued. And today we have 4,400 people, and we have about 2,600 library cards in the library. So that doesn't take into account that Foxcroft was also using the library, and they're not included in that population, but it does show that there were a lot of people using the library at that time. One of the things that the library focused on in its early years was working with schools. So there were still a lot of rural schools that didn't have many books. So the Thompson Free Library would box up books and send them to all the rural schools in the area. And this is from the 1906 town report, and this is from the school report, which basically, to summarize, it says, we received these books, the children really appreciate them, and we put them to good use. And then from the library report, they said, we loved sending these books, it really got kids to the library later, so it was mutually beneficial. And then in 1907, the librarian gets a pretty substantial raise. The library is open every day, and so it's a full-time job now. The assistant librarian and the janitor are two separate people now, which is great for the assistant librarian. And the librarian gets an expense account, which is pretty fancy. And this is actually from the outside of the town report that we have at the library. So someone had penciled in, librarian salary increased because the library is now open daily. So they were taking notes of why. The old town reports, you could tell people went and they actually took notes as to what was happening. So there's notes in the margin. It's a really good resource.
John, read the last paragraph on this school report.
There has been but one criticism come to our notice. One little girl became very much interested in some stories of animal life told in child language and took the book home. Her mother had her return it at once with instructions to the teacher not to let the little girl have any more such trash to fill up her head with. It's pretty. It's pretty funny that things like that show up in the town report. It is really interesting, and I always tell people that say like, you know, things are terrible now, and like everything is so biased, and people are always fighting. And I'm like, no, this is. You read newspapers and you find out what actually happened. It's the same stuff that's always been happening. It's just different people, and they have more electricity now. That's basically the only difference. It's the same stuff. It's really interesting. So these are some of the lighter side things of the first few years. There was the library at the rally at the library. There was a band, there was dancing, there was ice cream and cake, and it was a fundraiser for the library. Here we had a book booth at Central Hall to raise money and buy books. People basically came in and they had books for sale that you would buy. You would get a book plate with your name on it, and then it would be donated to the library. And this is actually, they had many spelling competitions, which were something that people really enjoyed at that time. And the money went towards the library. E.A. Thompson spelled signet with an S, and he lost. And it raised about $33 for the library, which was a pretty sizable amount at the time. So in 1907, Mary Averill becomes the librarian. This is another confusing area because she is the sister of Anna Boynton Averill, who wrote the poem, The Thompson Free Library. But at the same time, there were two Mary Averills and there were two Anna Averills in town at the same time, and they were both sisters. Phyllis has finally confirmed that these two were sisters, the librarian and the poet, but this took several days to confirm. So she'd been involved in literary endeavors previously. You may remember that she addressed this study of literature at the Baptist Church, so she's a pretty good candidate to take over as the librarian. So the library expands physically and figuratively. They dug the basement that is currently there now, and that was used for storage. They put a bathroom in the basement as well. There was a bathroom downstairs. They had to go outside to go to the bathroom, but it was more convenient than not having a bathroom or having an outhouse. And it became a full-time-ish position. It seems like it shifted a little bit throughout the years, but it was basically a full-time job rather than something that someone did for like 10 or 15 hours a week. And she was the librarian for almost 20 years. So she was the third longest librarian after Shirley Surratt, who was the librarian for 30 years, and Helen Fogler, who was librarian from 1997 to 2018. And she did a lot of the work of making the library, always expanding, always trying new things, and she was kind of a stabilizing force because she was the librarian for 20 years. And that's all I have. Does anyone have any questions or any comments? To build the library? No, I don't know the actual number. Do you know the actual number?
No.
Oh, okay. No, it was a very sizable, investment, and it's really fortunate that he was able to donate that full steel.
Around
Something over $10,000. But they don't say how much, but he spent more than $10,000.
I've always admired the carvings.
Yeah.
They don't do that on civic things anymore. It makes it really special.
There's actually, so if you go to the front door and you walk up to the front door, there's wooden carvings on the ceiling of that, which are really, it's impressive, and I don't know why you would do that other than trying to make it look as ornate as possible.
Basically, it's excellent.
Yeah.
Surviving so well after all those years.
Yeah. And one of the things that I really do appreciate about the library is that it has been expanded upon and added to twice, but from the street it still has the same look as it did before. Some libraries have moved, some have expanded in ways that it's a lot more visible, but
Did you come across anything in your research about old librarians being buried under that granite bench?
you keep threatening me with that, Jefferson.
You reserve a spot there for you.
Oh, okay. All right. Any other questions, comments?
Nice job.
Yeah. The Lou Stevens book that I referenced, the 100 Years of the Thompson Free Library, has a lot of these things in it. I did some of my own research to fill in some of the other things, and I would find something interesting and just kind of go off in a corner, but hopefully you found it interesting too. So.
Very good.
Yeah.
Good job.